Are you confused about real food and what's healthy and good for the planet? Do you need the facts about local, organic, and sustainable food? Well, get ready to change the way you eat. Get ready for The Appropriate Omnivore with Aaron Zober.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Appropriate Omnivore. I'm your host, Aaron Zober, covering lifestyles in the world of real food. If this isn't your first time listening to my podcast, then you know how important I see fermentation being to a nutrient-dense lifestyle. My guest today is Austin Durant. Austin founded the Fermenters Club in San Diego and wrote the book Fearless Fermenting. Austin, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Aaron. It's great to be here. I know we've known each other for a few years, so finally glad we're getting to chat on air, so to speak.
We have. I think it was only a matter of time before we connected because we've both done lots of great things for the real food community and for the fermentation community, and I know we've seen each other at many events that we've attended, some that you've ran, other ones where we've just both been attendees because we share a lot of similar interests in food.
Absolutely.
Yes, and so obviously, as I explained, you're big on fermentation, and I've done lots of podcasts talking about this, and everybody has different ways that they were first introduced to fermentation. So let's hear what yours is.
Absolutely, yeah. So sort of on my journey to discover, where does our food come from? I just started being curious about that. And along that path, I discovered the Weston A. Price Foundation, which we're both avid supporters and members of. And one of the pillars that they referred to, of course, is eating fermented foods. And that coincided with watching an episode. I used to watch this show on Food Network called Good Eats. And the episode was about cabbage. And the host, Alton Brown, made some sauerkraut. And I'm like, that looks kind of easy. So I did it and did the fermentation, followed his recipe. And man, it's no exaggeration to say that it literally changed the course of my life. I ate it. It was salty. It was crunchy. It was powerful. And I started to feel a little bit better. I wasn't ailing or anything, but I definitely could feel a subtle shift, probably due to the new infusion of good microbes into my system. And so that's really like kind of looking around like, why am I discovering this just now? Time I was in my 30s. So I sort of got inspired to start doing research online and started writing my own blog, and that morphed into Fermenters Club, and just been called to do this, an evangelist for microbes and for fermented food.
I love Alton Brown, and a lot of people say that sauerkraut is the first food to start with in terms of if you want to make your own fermentations. Is that something that you would agree with?
I would say it's very straightforward. There are a few, say, even more simple recipes that you can find in Fearless Fermenting. But yeah, sauerkraut, if you know how to use a chef knife and you can pour salt and use your hands to massage it, it's drop dead easy. It's really just salt and cabbage at its base.
So you mentioned Alton Brown as your introduction to fermentation. Are there other people as well that had an influence on you in learning about fermenting?
Absolutely. In fact, I talk a little bit about this in the book, and the title of the section is called Am I the Forrest Gump of Fermentation? And the reason is because as soon as I founded the club, and this was in 2011, discovering on my journey to learn about this stuff, some of the superstars at the time, and even still, like Sandor Katz, I got an opportunity to meet him at a fermentation conference at which Michael Pollan was also happy to be there. So I literally was just like, oh, hey guys, hanging out with the stars of that world. And actually the previous year, I got to meet Hannah Crum, who I'm sure you know is the queen of the kombucha revivalist
Oh,
movement.
yes, I know her very well.
She's awesome. So I literally got to learn how to make kombucha in her apartment in Los Angeles. So that was fun. And so that was just the beginning of it. And then I just kept with it. And along that way, I got to meet Joel Salatin briefly in 2015. I got to meet people like Kirsten and Christopher Shockey, who's written a series of amazing fermentation books. So really, it's just, I feel like I'm privileged to be able to get to meet these people and how they influenced me. Specifically, I also got to go to Sandor, his fermentation residency in Tennessee that very year too. So again, the universe just saying, okay, you want this, here you go, and giving me all these opportunities. So I feel very grateful for that. So that's kind of why I say I just kind of showed up and middle of stuff going on and people and the right people and stuff. So yeah, those are just some influential people in my career path here.
That is quite a lineup of people. So I see what you mean about being the Forrest Gump, a lot of my heroes in there. So then I know after you learned about this, you started the Fermenters Club. How did that come about?
Yeah, so that was a natural outcropping of just, hey, what do we do? How do we spread the word on this? And so it was originally a food swap idea where I would make a batch of sourdough bread, you'd make some pickles, and we could just get together and maybe do a fermented leaning food swap. We're not like dogmatic about it. Like, oh, if it's not fermented, don't bother. You bring it. So it was just a gathering of friends and just to help encourage the making, but also the sharing of food. And so that's what the club became. And that's now just the name of the business where I do my classes and my workshops. And that's where the festivals get launched. So yeah, that was the genesis of the club because who doesn't want to be in a cool club? So that was the idea of just creating communities. And that's the mission of Fermenters Club is to teach people why and how to ferment food at home and also to create communities that are connected through our guts. I mean, that's a very specifically chosen set of words because I think that's important not only to understand this alchemical and magical nature of these foods, but also to share them and to gather around it because that's just something quintessentially human that we
I
all
would
need.
agree. And then from the Fermenters Club, more recently, you've written the book Fearless Fermenting. What inspired you to write that book?
Yeah, I feel like look, maybe 2 or 3 years into this venture, I was like, I'm probably going to write a book someday. And then there was a short period, I want to say it was like 2014 and 15, where a bunch of publishing companies were just looking to add a title to their domain. And so one reached out to me, and I had friends who also had been given book deals. And at the time, I was just like, you know what? I don't think I have enough to say. So that was 2015. But the idea was still there. The seed was just a slow growing seed. And so in late 2021, I realized, okay, now it's probably time to turn this into a book. I was hanging out with some people in the permaculture world, and they had just recently written, self-published a book. And so it just really inspired me and the stars aligned. And so that's what launched me into declaring that I wanted to write the book. And then that journey began. So that was about a 4-year journey, but I couldn't be more pleased with the way it looks and feels has exceeded my expectations 100-fold. And that's good. I like the fact that I can be a fan of my own work. But I guess it was just being my first book. It was surprising to see what the process is and also to see that, oh, this is actually something I created. So marvelous. I encourage anybody to write a book in their life, put it on your bucket list. So that was the genesis of Fearless Fermenting. That actually debuted it at the Weston A. Price Foundation Conference in Florida last October, in which we met.
Yes, you had a great debut of that book with your exhibition booth, and also you did a great talk there. So I can certainly understand how, when you first get into it, the idea of writing a book of do you know enough? So was part of it that you wanted to learn more fermentation recipes? And when you first started this, obviously, there were less ones that you knew of than as time progressed.
Right. I think the inspiration was simply over the years, and again, it was probably about 10 years before I put ink to paper. I was trying to find my voice, right? And I think that's metaphorically, but also what's my particular take on the subject? Because, like you said, Sandor Katz and the Noma guys from Scandinavia, these just superstars that were chefs and top in their industry, were writing books as well. So it was just a matter of me finding what do I do that's unique. And the voice really developed doing the workshops that I taught. So that was been my bread and butter. So I left my day job in 2015 to pursue this full time. And that became bread and butter, was just doing immersive hands-on workshops and developing my own perspective on it. And enough so that I said, okay, now I can be a contributor to the canon of fermentation literature that's out there. So that was my intention.
I can see that. I think interacting with people gives you a very great chance to find your own voice and your tone. I think it's very similar to me with doing this podcast, that gives me a way to express exactly who I am with all the people that I interact with.
That's a very good. People reflect our own good and shadow sides to us. So I'm glad you got to do that. And that absolutely, I see how that could develop one just by having good conversations with people. So good on you for doing that. And yeah, you've been doing it for a number of years, right?
I have, yes, since 2012. That's when the podcast first premiered and the blog in 2011, and still going.
Wow, we kind of had the similar time frames of when we got started on our journeys. I like that. That's cool.
We did, yes. And so in what ways would you say your book is different than, say, the ones by Sandor Katz?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read all of them. I certainly have read Sandor's book. Mine, again, not good or bad, but I just wanted to follow more of a classical cookbook look and feel, with the photography and the graphical design. So yeah, you would observe it as, oh, this is like a baking book or another visually intensive cookbook. So there's that. And then what I created that's unique to my book is a scale. I call it the Fermatrix, so like fermentation matrix. And it is basically a way to rate the relative complexity of making a specific fermented dish, right? Because fermentation, if you're new to it, has the element of time. A lot of dishes you'll make, it'll be ready and you'll have a dinner. And fermentation is, well, you make it and then you wait, right? So I wanted to create a way for people to understand the relative complexity. And by that, I mean factors like how many ingredients are there? And is this what we call a wild ferment, or do you need to add a specific culture? And is there special equipment needed? Is there a potential hazard factor? So these are about half of the aspects that I call that went into creating a score, and then ranking each one of the dishes so that you know just by looking at it, oh, this has a Fermatrix score of, say, 8, which is on the simpler side. And then you flip to the back of the book and you'll see miso is probably the most complex of a score of 21. Choose your own adventure, right? So that's something that's unique to the recipes that I put in the book.
I love that. The Fermatrix fermentation is a little bit different than other types of food, especially in the fact that it takes longer. It's not just something where you can set the oven for, say, 40 minutes or even an hour. One time I remember I was trying a fermented dish and someone said, well, how did it come out? And I said, it's still fermenting. I haven't been able to try it yet.
Right, exactly. That's that element of time. And, we could get all philosophical about that and what the implications of that are, but I'll let you get there if you got it in your list of questions. But yeah, it's a new element.
Yes. And so as you were writing this book, as you explained, it took time, several years. Were there new recipes that you came up with, new ferments that you learned while writing it? And was it a challenge of then saying, oh, do I fit this into the book? Where do I fit it in?
Yeah, the exercise at first was the naive 2020 guy who was at the beginning of the journey. Like, I've got a blog that's got over 100 recipes. I'll just copy and paste and then I'll have my book. Totally did not work at all, because obviously content within a blog post is very different than the content on a printed page. So I learned that quickly. I basically redo all of the recipes, make sure bulletproof test them, and then make them more consistent. So that was that process of doing that. And then, yeah, I'm still evolving along the way. But let's see, I would say my newest venture at the point where I started the book was sourdough bread. So I hadn't really explored sourdough until late 2019. So I was still learning as I was writing the book, an example. But a lot of the recipes had already been on the blog for a number of years. But yeah, I mean, and even to this day, I'm still learning new ways, for example, to what can I slip sourdough starter discard into, right? Because that's a byproduct of the sourdough bread process. And it's still a viable, tasty thing that you can pretty much put into just about anything that calls for flour. So I just made this morning a sourdough skillet cornbread that turned out pretty good. So just as an example, like, we're always learning, we're always experimenting. And so it's a continual process.
Nice. So you say you got into sourdough making in 2019, just a year before then, everybody was doing it during the pandemic.
Right. I like to say I was doing it before it was cool. Like,
yes, I was thinking the same thing.
Just by a few months. I think it was like December of 2019 is when I started my original San Diego sourdough, and it's still going. So it's a little over 5 years now. So yeah, it's a fun. Each culture of sourdough has its own terroir. And so San Diego is unique, even among, where you are up in Pasadena versus Boston. It's neat to just keep something like that alive and going.
And then obviously the pandemic hit in 2020 when you were starting writing your book. Was that in any way inspiration for you to start writing a book with what was going on in our world?
Supposedly. I mean, honestly, I just kind of kept doing what I wanted to do, and we had to make some adjustments. I was doing a lot of public appearances, and those venues were temporarily shut down. So I just wound up shifting my classes to my backyard. And so I would say, yeah, it probably gave me more of a reason to put my nose to the grindstone and get it done. So that, I would say, yeah, thinking aloud now, that's probably was an impetus for me to get going on it, just because there was just less work at that point, less outside work. So yeah, I suppose it tangentially influenced my work.
And your book covers so many types of ferments, and you're explaining the different kinds, lacto, wild fermentation. Obviously, we're not going to talk about everyone because I don't know how many hours that would take to do it. But what are some of your favorite ferments?
Oh my gosh. I always give almost a canned answer now, but it kind of depends on the season. So right now we're in winter. Obviously, I'm baking a lot just to keep the house warm. So a lot of sourdough bread, but also the cabbage and brassica ferments like your sauerkrauts and kimchis are both really good to have supplementally with every meal. And then I would say more on the summertime, my favorites tend towards cucumber pickles and maybe kombucha made with seasonal local fresh fruit. Those are probably two of my, just the standard go-tos. But and then, yeah, like I said, tinkering with sourdough starter is fun just to see where I can slip it in. So that's baking is, I guess it's a year-round thing, but it's like when it's August and it's almost 90 degrees in my house, like I don't want to bake a loaf of bread, So there is some seasonality, I would say, well, there is in general with the availability of ingredients, for example. And I do touch on that in the book in terms of the flow and the ebb and flow of the seasons, the way that we ferment and the way that our ancestors did. Again, not try to use the word should, but it would be better, you'd have better results if it reflected what was going on and what was available locally. So I try to honor how our ancestors lived in that way in terms of what's local, what's available, what needs to be preserved, are some of the ways I think about it.
That's a good point you bring up about fermentations being seasonal and different ones that are best depending on what season it is during the year. My first introduction to ferment, before I even knew what it was, were pickles. And it's important for people to know that to get truly the best pickles, you do need the pickling cucumbers, which are a seasonal thing in the summer. And of course, I also want to say that I am so thankful for your pickle recipe, which that was one of the ones I know on your blog before you had the book. I love that recipe. That's been the one that I go to whenever I make my pickles, and it always comes out excellent, thanks to you.
Oh, great. I'm glad to hear that, man. That means a lot. If I can help people make good pickles, that warms my heart. So I'm glad it's working.
Yes, because a lot of people have said when I've had parties, they love my pickles and I'm very pleased with making them, but of course I have to owe part of that to you. Would you say pickles are a more difficult one to make?
I think there are some subtle things that people generally have issues with, and that has to do with the crunchiness, right? Because everybody wants that classic crunchy dill pickle. And so I'd say that's the only part where there's a couple of tricks up our sleeve that, as you know the recipe well now, you can help create some firmness in the cucumber if you add a couple ingredients to the brine. Yeah, you add something that's got some tannins in it, which is just a compound plants create, and that seems to support the cell walls, and that's sort of the secret, if you will, to a crispy pickle. So like grape leaves have a lot of tannins, or oak leaves, or fruit tree leaves like apples and your pears and stuff. So yeah, I'd say that's one trick. And then, just finding the right brine, which is the percentage of salt to water, and starting with the freshest ingredients. And to your point, using pickling cucumbers, because not all cucumbers are created equal. I have a little section in that where I break down the different major styles of cukes that people have, the slicers versus the Japanese, the English, et cetera. So, and talk about what makes them different and what makes some better for fermentation than others.
I believe yours was the first pickle recipe I tried, and they came out well, and I've tried some other ones and have had an issue with them not being as firm. So I think that you've tackled pretty well the way to how to keep pickles firm, because I think even some recipes, you may miss some nuances that it doesn't quite work. So I think there's something you nailed about how to get them firm, from my experience, certainly.
Well, good. To wax a little bit woo, I remember we didn't really grow up with a lot of hardcore ferments, like you have suburban sort of upbringing, and, we had like yogurt in a cup and stuff like that. And they're fridge pickles, which are a totally different preservation. Yes. But my mom recounted, it's like when she was a little girl growing up in New York, she would go into the deli and there'd be a straight up wine barrel, 55-gallon, that was just full of cucumber pickles in the Jewish deli. And they would just be sitting there and they would just constantly ferment. So point being is like she had that in her memory, in her epigenetic memory. And so maybe I somehow absorbed that, even though we never talked about it directly. But yeah, so I'll claim a little bit of woo for that. It's in my blood, the pickle recipe. So
yes. Oh, that's interesting. Yes. And pickles, I know they're not the easiest, but I do think that pickles are one of people's favorite ferments. For instance, I've seen some companies that make sauerkraut, because sauerkraut doesn't seem to be as liked as well as pickles. So I know some companies have gone with making a dill pickle sauerkraut. We have a little dill pickle chip in the middle of a sauerkraut. That's been seen by some as the gateway kraut.
Yes. I have a garlic dill kraut recipe in the book. I call it the shoulder season, right? Right when, cucumbers are sort of going out in the late summer and cabbage hasn't quite come in. But yeah, it's delightful to have that combination where it's a kraut that you can spread out on a sandwich, but also still get reminiscent of garlic and dill. Yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite variations of sauerkraut.
And do you think that recipe is a good one for people who haven't made pickles before, where it's a little easy because they're in pickle chips to make it than, say, fermenting a whole pickling cucumber?
Yeah, I would say it's a little simpler. In fact, you can make that recipe and get the flavors without actually adding cucumber. Let's say it's completely out of season. You could just use garlic and fresh dill if they're available. But yeah, if you have any cucumber, you would mix up and mash up the cabbage to soften it and then sprinkle some cucumbers in just to add texture and give it that pickle. And it's fascinating to see that the fermentation process will still proceed just in a different medium, so to speak, right? Like with pickles, they're usually whole and they're in a brine. In a sauerkraut, they are in a brine, but they're surrounded by chopped up pieces of cabbage. And it's just fascinating to see the same process proceed. But that would be a way to foolproof, but it's simple to do that if you can sprinkle in cucumbers. And with that particular recipe, you could use any style of cucumber, whether it's a slicer or whatever, because you're just sort of chunking it up into small.
Oh, oh,
So
that's a
it's a
good point
slightly
to bring
different,
up.
little bit of
I
a
hadn't thought about that.
yeah, it's a great way to like, let's say you're jonesing for cukes, but like I said, maybe it's October and all they've got is the longer slicer styles. So slice those up, quarter them, throw them in the garlic dill kraut, and then they'll still turn out to be pickle chunks. It's cool.
So I think that might be a good recipe for some people to start with. And you said you don't have to use cucumbers, sometimes just the flavor. I've seen different companies in the CPG world introducing dill pickle kraut. Yeah, some have done it with full pickled cucumber slices in it, and others they do just the flavor of the dill and the garlic and
Right.
other things that make the dill pickle flavor. And I think both work and definitely are a way of a kraut. It's interesting. There's so many different flavors and varieties I've seen of kraut these days.
I know. I'm pleased by that as well. The variation.
Me too. And it goes a lot of ways. So dill pickle is for people that want something more on the sour side. They like pickles, but maybe they have issue with the kraut. But also I think that's been pretty amazing is, so we see the savory krauts, that's kraut's typically known for, but we've also seen some of the sweeter krauts, like for instance, krauts with apples in them.
I like experimenting with that. In fact, my classic recipe that's literally all over the cover is apple ginger kraut. So you start off with sour apple, like a tart apple. And then when you mix it in and ferments, because there's so many other sour notes coming through, like the lactic acid and the acetic acid, for example, that it actually brings out the sweetness of an otherwise tart apple. Like if you just ate that apple fresh, it would be very tart, would be the overtones. So that's kind of cool. And then I also, I'd say invented it, but I certainly made it my own is strawberry sauerkraut. So what you do is you dehydrate the berries first because you kind of want to slow down because there's a lot of sugar in fruits. The fructose attracts things like yeast, and yeasts do a different kind of fermentation, which is alcohol, than the bacteria, which are the ones that are mostly found in our vegetables. So, point being, I'm using air quotes to slow down the yeast fermentation by dehydrating the fruits, but they also then infuse into the kraut. So, I have a strawberry sauerkraut recipe, which has, I think, fennel seeds and maybe even a little bit of fresh ginger. And it's funny, I'll call it a breakfast kraut because it's savory as well, but it does have the hints of the berries in it. So, yeah, there's infinite variations of what you can do with it. But yeah, it's neat to see you can make flavors that you wouldn't necessarily think should go together, like work.
Well, I like the breakfast kraut. A lot of people don't think of kraut as a breakfast food, but actually, to me, I think it's one of the best foods you can have for breakfast.
Oh my gosh, for sure. Yeah, like scrambled eggs on toast, avocado. I mean, yeah, I agree. But yeah, a lot of it is about breaking perceptions. I mean, some people, I would imagine people that I've encountered, most of them, when you say sauerkraut, they shudder because they think of that it's that very flaccid, pale yellow side dish that you just tolerate when you're eating a sausage or something, right? And that's because that style of sauerkraut is pasteurized, it's not fermented, it's not alive. And so I can see why it's trauma. Ew, sauerkraut, if that's your only impression of it. So I feel like that's what I'm doing is evangelizing. Yeah, like sauerkraut. And then if I happen to have some, I can share it. The recipes that I use, I usually mix a green and a red cabbage, and it makes this just hot pink, very appetizing color, right? So one at a time, got to change people's minds if they have a negative memory of sauerkraut in that way.
I know that for me, it was the whole pasteurized sauerkraut that gave me a bad impression of it. And I still really don't order sauerkraut at restaurants because I figure a lot of times it's going to be the pasteurized. But unlike pickles, where my family loved, didn't really grow up with sauerkraut. But yes, through Weston A. Price, that was certainly where I was introduced to sauerkraut. And when I saw the sauerkraut that Weston A. Price talks about, I realized that's very different than that pasteurized sauerkraut that they offer to put on your hot dog at a baseball game.
Yeah, you got it. Yes, you had that experience as well. Yeah. Getting back to an old world way. Like I say, it's not that many generations removed from normal, maybe two or three at this point, maybe four. But, usually somebody will remember, oh, yeah, they have ancestry that Eastern Europe, or they're like, oh, yeah, I remember my grandma had a crock of that always in her basement. Like, it's like they have to reach in their memories to when their grandparents did it. So, yeah, it's good to see that people like Weston A. Price have just been touting that all along. And now more contemporary, we're just bringing it back into our diet.
You could say people reach back into their culture.
Yes, absolutely. And that's another thing that is so appealing to me about fermentation is that regardless of where your ancestors came from on the planet, they had a tradition of fermentation. And that's one of the ways we can understand other cultures is just by looking at their cuisine. Experiencing it ourselves just makes you realize we're one big human family.
Right.
We may look a little different on the outside, but we all have the same desires and we all respond well to good foods that are nutrient dense and microbially rich.
So it's culture in more meaning than one.
Absolutely. Yeah. That wordplay has been fun.
Oh, yeah. I have a lot of fun with that on my blog. You could say they're keeping this food alive.
Yeah. Yes. Keeping the culture alive. Yeah, it is. It's multi-layered. Absolutely.
Yes. So you talked about the strawberry sauerkraut. And you said that one you hadn't invented, but you created a recipe for it. Were there any ferments in your book that were completely invented by you while writing it?
Gosh, let's see. Yeah, I'll take credit for I'll call it cultured eggnog.
Ooh,
So
I love that.
was a big fan of eggnog because it's nutrient dense and it's sweet and it's a treat. And that I was also pretty well versed in how to make cultured dairy like kefir. And so I'm like, wonder what would happen if I did that. So I wound up again going back to I think it was an Alton Brown recipe and then retrofitting kefir in there and then curing it in the fridge for a few weeks and it's revelatory. It has a texture that's very unique, almost like a cappuccino foam,
Wow.
but it's still got the tanginess of the kefir. And then I try to use just honey instead of sugar. So it's just this very rich, again, you don't have to just wait till the holidays for it, but typically people do. So I had never come across that before. Conceivably, somebody was doing it and making it, but I feel like that was one that popped up. I'm kind of flip through the book here, see if there's anything else that jumps out. Yeah, that's probably the main one that.
Well, that's a good one.
And then, okay, one year I had an abundance of, you know what nasturtium is? It's a ground cover that it makes these little seeds that taste a little bit like wasabi. They're very pungent and it's in the mustard family. I had an abundance of those. I'm like, what if I could pickle them? So I made what I call capers out of them by basically just brining them and adding some spices that you would use for capers. And those wound up being a hit, an unexpected hit. Again, I'm not going to claim intellectual property on it, but it was just me tinkering around trying to come up with a way to preserve the harvest. So nasturtium pod capers is another one.
Love it. And yes, I think eggnog you can have any time of year, certainly around the holidays. Although I know also some want to have it in July, say at Christmas in July.
Right. Interestingly, like that's when those foods are most abundant, right? Chickens are laying at the height of their laying, cows are milking. It's interesting how, but I do believe, again, not to get too far into the history of it, I think people would put it up in earlier seasons and then it would just cure and then be ready around the
Oh,
holidays,
wow.
especially if you're using the high percent of alcohol. So the version I've got in my book is non-alcoholic. So you have to be mindful because you're still dealing with a live culture, right? And you're feeding a lot of food. So there's some how to be careful and do it safely tips on there. But versus if you're using alcohol for your traditional eggnog, it would just obliterate any of the probiotic content as well as any potential pathogens, right? So that's probably another reason why they added high amounts of liquor to the traditional nogs.
We've talked about some of the most well-known, most popular ferments, pickles, sauerkraut, and eggnog, not traditionally a ferment, but certainly popular foods. So now I want to get into what you think are some of the overlooked ferments.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say that one of the more simple, in fact, it's the very first of the recipes in the book, is fermented grains, what we call porridge from fairy tales, right? So you simply take an amount of oats or barley or whatever, wheat, and then let it soak in water. Again, this is classic nourishing tradition stuff from Sally Fallon. And then it'll just start to ferment because all of the microbes are on the grains already. And then what it does is it pre-cooks it and it pre-digests it. And that's just a go-to during the winter months where you want something hearty. You can just have what I call a porridge pot just sitting on your counter. It's even ready after, anywhere from 1 to 7 days. And then you spoon it out, throw it into a pot, heat it up, and you're not waiting an hour. It's just already cooked. And then you just replenish the pot with extra grains, and then it's a continual little ferment you got going. So I would say just straight up, yeah, like hot cereals are really fermented again because it's a wild ferment that's just going on for the few days it sits in the jar.
They are ferments because a lot of people think of simply the instant oatmeal or those shelf-stable cereals, which Weston A. Price does not recommend, but they do recommend basically what is the original cereal, which is oatmeal. And traditionally, yes, it took time to ferment it. And the cereal that we have now that you see on those supermarket shelves, those are all made for ways to cut corner and have it done faster.
Oh my God, yeah. Let's not even talk about what the dearth of nutrients is in there. Yes, so yeah, cereal.
Right, and the extrusion. Yes, we could go on and on about those. The basic takeaway from this is that if you want to do cereal, do it the traditional way of the oatmeal, the porridge.
Yep. So yeah, porridge is one. What's another one that's overlooked? Let me think here. I think one that's not as popular, at least in the US, is vegetable kvass. Beet kvass is the most common. Basically, it's an infusion.
Right.
You chop up beets, fuse it in the brine. And then, I say in the book, it's flipping the script. So when you're brining vegetables and you put them in a brine and you let them sit, usually you're consuming the vegetables. Well, in this case, you're actually doing it to make the brine. And it's beets are already super nutrient dense. So adding the layer of fermentation to it, it's really good for your liver. It's good for women's health. And it's very simple to make. So I think that's another one that hasn't really caught on, but it could at any moment because it's simple and really good for you.
Yes, beet kvass is one that I certainly would like to see more of. I know a lot of people in the Weston Price community have expressed how we should see more beet kvass along with these other fermentations that we have like sauerkraut, and I hope so. I know that we've seen there was an exhibitor at the Wise Traditions conference a couple of years ago, Garden Goddess Ferments, who had a wonderful beet kvass, and I do hope to see more on the market with that. I know some people don't like beets, and that's something which I think turns some people off from it. Of course, with me, what I say about beet kvass, though, is to say, well, if your reason for not liking beets is, you think they're too sweet, and that beet kvass, it's the opposite. It ferments it, and it actually has a rather sour taste to it. So I think that if that's your reason, give beet kvass a try, and you may be surprised.
Agreed. I almost want to compare it to a contemporary, V8, right? It has a bit more of a vegetal flavor. Yeah, and maybe it needs a good marketing, a PR campaign for it. But yeah, there's ways to not trick people, but yeah, maybe just we call it kvass and don't even mention beets. And then it's like, to your point, yeah, it has the earthiness of beets, but it's not sweet in the same way. The texture's completely different because you're consuming liquid rather than the beets. So yeah, that's a good point.
And if you really don't like beets, even in the kvass form, there are other vegetables that kvass can be made out of.
Absolutely. We talk about some of the veggie mixes that you might have heard of, like jardiniere, which is frequently found in Costco.
Oh, yes.
And escabeche, which is one that's kind of like the Latin version, where I call it affectionately taco bar veggies, because when you go to a taco bar, you'll see pickled carrots and onions. So yeah, you can eat those. And then when you're done with consuming them, the brine is just as powerful as kvass, because it's literally the same thing. It's an infused liquid with salt in it that's had veggies in it. So you can definitely reuse the brine once you've consumed all the solids for really probiotic purposes. I will often use leftover brine for marinades or just to flavor stuff. You just keep the bottles of it in there. And, the soup needs more salt. And then I'll just put in brine instead of salt, for example. So there's no reason to waste or dump that very precious brine if you're doing this stuff just because the cucumbers are gone or whatever. Let people know that.
Yes, there's lots of great things you can do with brines. Bubby's Pickles, they had a great recipe for curing chicken wings in brine from their dill pickles.
I like it. Yeah.
That was one of my favorite. I made that recently and it was a pretty big hit. Have you thought about writing some recipes for what you can use with brine?
See, yeah, there's a section, 5 things you can do with brine. But as far as writing recipes, and like I said, I just keep it on hand. I almost think of it like mentally it's a substitute for something like apple cider vinegar.
Yes.
Because again, oftentimes there are acetic acid and other acids. Now, apple cider vinegar is probably generally not as salty as, say, pickle brine, but keep it on hand and think of it like seasoning. When something needs salt and or liquid, that's how I just think about it. It's more like a staple rather than a specific recipe. But yeah, you could certainly do, if you're into drinking beer, you can do what they call the pickleback, where you drop pickle brine in the beer. I'm not into that stuff anymore. You can use it it's a cocktail mixer. You can use it in salad dressing to make an emulsion. it goes on and on, really. It's just flavorful, probiotic, salt, liquid. So you need it everywhere in cooking, right?
You can also do that with kombucha similarly.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. And for people looking at that, then I recommend our mutual friend Hannah Crum talks about that in the Big Book of Kombucha. That's a lot of the book is different recipes of things you can make with kombucha.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hannah's definitely one of my favorite fermenters, and her book is amazing. It's inspired me. I've got a section on kombucha in there, but her book is phenomenal for anybody who wants to get into kombucha. And like you said, has more than just how many different kombucha recipes can I make, but what can I do with the extra stuff? In fact, I started my kombucha vinegar pot based on her recipe, which is basically really, really, really ripe kombucha that sort of starts to taste like vinegar. And then you can actually feed that and really get to a place where you're closing in on the acidity level of straight vinegar. But I found that to be more accessible to me because I didn't really have a cider vinegar mother, but I've got lots of kombucha mothers. So again, that's just one of the many things you can do with these cultures and to make your own vinegar.
Yes, that's something I'd like to see more of is kombucha-based vinegar because vinegar is another problem where a lot of it is dead. It's pasteurized. Of course, apple cider vinegar usually is raw. And I'm seeing now some people making kombucha vinegar. There's a company, Biora, that has a number of kombucha vinegar products, including salad dressings. And that's something that I hope we see more of.
Absolutely good. I'm glad you're pointing that out. Yeah, people are starting to understand that maybe it evolved as, okay, we have overripe kombucha. I don't want to throw it away. What can we do with it? And even if that, meaning at a commercial scale. So if that's what prompted these products to be introduced into other products, great. But yeah, absolutely something you can do that same technique of employing at home.
We've discussed a lot of different types of ferments to make, from some of the easiest to some that are a little bit on the moderate level. What would you say are some of the hardest foods to ferment?
Yeah, I would say so. I have one of the later chapters in the book called Epic Ferments, and those are usually ones that require sort of multiple stages. So a classic example would be miso paste, right? So miso paste is made from some type of cooked bean, traditionally soybeans, but you can use other legumes. And then koji, which is actually rice that has been cultured itself. You let it myceliate because that's what it is. It's actually a fungus. And then it creates a little fuzz on the rice and it starts to make an enzymatic powerhouse. Then you take that koji, mix it in with the beans, and then you pack it with salt and you create a ferment. So just to get to that point, you can see there's just a number of steps. So the koji culturing takes about 2 days. And then the miso, depending on the style that you're making, can take anywhere from 2 months to a year. So I would say that's some of the more complex ferments to do, but nothing that people can't handle. It's cooking beans. And then koji, as far as that goes, you can buy pre-made koji. I like to say it's a next level experience if you want to actually incubate it and make it yourself, because it's just slightly more, like I said, it's an additional step. You need to create somewhat of a controlled climate so that the koji prospers, a little bit elevated temperatures, a little bit elevated humidity. But I'd say that's a classic example of a multi-stage ferment.
And with some of these harder ferments, has it been trial and error for you where it's taken a couple times to get them right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The first time I made koji, there's just a few things you can do improperly. Like maybe you don't steam the rice enough and then the mycelium can't get in there and then they don't really thrive. Or you let it go and then it will turn into spores. And you don't want that. You actually want to stop the process of culturing right before it finishes its life cycle. And so been many times where I let it go and it turns this blue-green color and you're like, it's probably, you don't want to use that. So yeah, definitely koji is a little bit temperamental until you sort of get the hang of it. And miso, yeah, once you've got the koji stabilized, making miso is pretty straightforward. But again, you're waiting a very long time, 6 months or a year before you get to enjoy it.
So if anyone has a little concerns about making the hard ones, you've heard it here that Austin himself, he wrote a book on all this and he was just like you where he had to learn a couple of trial and error. And I think that's a good inspiration for anyone that wants to try some of these harder ones is don't give up.
Right. I can't remember. I was listening to a podcast recently. It's so that we learn so much more from our failures than we do our successes. I mean, and so not to say that you're going to fail doing this stuff. And if that's what somewhat inspired the title of the book was people did have trepidation, the ones that came to my classes. And so I wanted to just let people know that there's not really a reason to be afraid. You follow the guidelines and use your senses and trust your senses, then you're going to be successful. Even if you do have to make a few batches of science experiment, you can always just generally throw those into the compost pile or recycle them. It's just something you maybe wouldn't want to eat, but So yeah, be fearless.
I was just thinking about that as we were talking about it, that title, Fearless Fermentation, fits in really well to what we're talking about being afraid to try some of the harder ones.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that's the whole journey.
Yeah, I see what the title is all about. Yeah, I think that's a good title because, yeah, a lot of people do have fears of fermentation, and it's important to face your
There you
fears.
go. Right.
And you have, I would say, continuing with your book and different sections of it, you have a very interesting chapter at the end of your book on traveling with ferments. Tell us more about that.
Right. So that was 7 or 8 years ago where fermented foods were not as ubiquitous as they are now. Not that they're ubiquitous everywhere, but you can certainly see a lot more brands. So let's say if I'm traveling to the East Coast or wherever, I can usually just go to a store now and find, a local brand of sauerkraut. But that wasn't always the case. And so if I had to go somewhere for a week, I did not want to be without my ferments. And so it just came out of trial and error again, how to do it. So I just wanted to provide people with a little bonus of here's what's worked for me in terms of how to pack your ferments if you're going to take them on the plane, and etiquette, like don't open your kimchi in the middle of an airplane, just stuff like that. But some of it's common sense, but it basically allows you to travel with your probiotics and have them wherever you're going. So that was why I wanted to include that there at the end.
And so we've talked a lot about the different recipes in your books. And as we explained at the beginning, you also have the Fermenters Club, which offers a wide variety of classes in fermentation. What are some of the upcoming classes that you have?
Great. Yeah. So we've got, these are mostly in San Diego, a hands-on fermented veggies workshop as part of a larger fair. The mushroom fair that's going on in San Diego is next weekend. So I'll be doing that. The following week after that, I'll be teaching sourdough bread in San Diego. And then I'll be doing another miso workshop while it's still early spring in early next month. And then I am trying to get back out on the road. In fact, I'm planning a tour, a short tour maybe, of the Pacific Northwest, including Alaska. So I will be in Alaska at a homesteading expo in early April. And probably around that time, I'm trying to book some stuff in Seattle, Washington, just because that's sort of the hop off point to get to Alaska. And there's a lot of stuff going on in the fermentation world in the Seattle area. So anyway, you can always go on fermentersclub.com and look at the calendar for what events that we're doing, always doing hands-on stuff and trying to participate in the community, as well as collaborating with people doing other things like homesteading, like permaculture and regenerative agriculture, because that's important. It's all part of a healthy ecosystem.
So you'll be found everywhere because obviously I'm based in Southern California, and yes, do have a lot of Southern California listeners, but also for the people listening outside of where this show is produced, some people have the chance to see you too. And I know I first learned about the Fermenters Club through that great San Diego Fermentation Festivals that used to hold. Is there any chance of bringing those back?
I mean, there could be. Obviously, I was planning to do one in 2020 and that didn't happen. And the book sort of took over my life, my energy. So I think so. And it's funny because you're certainly not the first person that's asked about it. And it really was a very worthy venture and thing to do. Although 2 out of the 5 festivals we did here in San Diego were rained out.
I remember that very
That's
well,
not why
the
I've held off. Like I said, it's mainly because I've been focusing on the book. But if I do resume it, it will be a different time of year, probably either in May or November. Probably wouldn't be 2025, but maybe 2026 would be a good time to shoot for. But yeah, because it really is, and especially now, because I think 5 years on since the last one, so 6 years, I think fermentation is just that much more popular. So I think we could have an even bigger party.
I think so. That'd be great. Yes. And I remember when you were looking at doing it in 2020, it was going to be later in the year. So right. I know that was something that you've looked at for a while for the future.
Yeah. So I think we can just pick that back up, that idea.
I think so too. Yeah, I think it's a good time to do it with more people making sourdough bread and yes, more people being aware of ferments, certainly than when you first got into this and when I first started doing my podcast.
Right.
So we're just about out of time, but before we go, tell the listeners again your website address where they can learn about Fermenters Club and your book and any other place on social media or the internet where they can learn more about all that you do.
Sure. So yeah, the fermentersclub.com website has recipes and video links and some of the lore. You can also order a copy of my book, a hardcover copy that I can sign if you order through the website. The book is also available on Amazon and Kindle, paperback and hardcover. And it's also available on my website. If you want to order directly from me, I can sign it for you. And then, yes, I have a pretty good YouTube channel following, and then social media like Facebook and Instagram. You can find us there, Fermenters Club. The handle on most of those. And yeah, that's where you can find us.
Wonderful. I'm glad you were able to come on the program and tell us about everything that you do, and I look forward to seeing future developments of the Fermenters Club.
Thanks, Aaron. It's been a real pleasure. Appreciate it.
Thank you. That's all for this episode of The Appropriate Omnivore. New episodes of the show are released every Wednesday. Follow me on social media for more information on the next episode. And to make sure you never miss any of my podcasts, subscribe to The Appropriate Omnivore on your favorite podcast site or app. You can also listen to all my podcasts on my website, appropriateomnivore.com. There you can find recipes from the guests I interview, plus all of my articles covering lifestyles in the world of real food. Until next time, my pantry is officially closed.